y'all, welcome back to another episode of Boss Up and Glow Up with Alexi Sample. I'm your host, and guess what, you guys? We are in season 3, meaning we have been chatting shit for 3 years now. I just want to take a second with that because this season definitely feels the most intentional for me. It feels like a whole shift, less about trying to become some ideal version of myself and more about understanding why I keep getting pulled back into the same patterns even when I know better. And I just wanted to open this episode up by saying January brings out so much pressure, okay? Quiet pressure, but pressure nonetheless. The pressure to catch up, to prove that this year you're gonna be different, or the pressure to finally do things the right way. Every January, people don't just set goals, they set expectations about who they're supposed to be now, and they're supposed to be more disciplined, more focused, more consistent, less messy, less emotional, and pretty much less human. And if you're listening to this and you feel that familiar mix of motivation and anxiety, I want you to know that you're not alone in that. Most people just don't talk about how heavy January can feel. They just talk about how exciting the new year's supposed to be. So, if you keep on starting over every January, if this feels like a cycle that you just can't quite break, this episode isn't here to hype you up. It's here to explain what's really happening underneath and why it makes so much sense when you start to see everything clearly. Sometimes just having a clean slate just makes you very comfortable. And January works because it gives your brain a clean slate. And I don't mean that in a cheesy motivational way, I mean it in a very real psychological way, okay? Your brain loves clean lines, it loves before and after, it loves clear categories because they reduce mental load. And when you say that was last year, you create that emotional distance from everything that didn't go the way you wanted. And that distance matters because carrying guilt is so exhausting. Carrying disappointment is so exhausting. Carrying the awareness that you tried and stopped is so exhausting. That awareness sits quietly in the background all year long. Every time you think about going back to the gym, every time you open up a planner, every time you say, I'm going to start again tomorrow, there's this subtle weight of, I've been here before. January says, you don't have to carry that right now. A new year gives you permission to set everything down without processing it first. You don't have to explain the unfinished goals. You don't have to sit with the habits that don't stick. You don't have to confront that motivation faded faster than you hoped it would. You just get to start again. And that feels relieving, very relieving. And not because you're irresponsible or you're avoiding growth, but because shame is heavy. Self judgment is heavy. Constantly narrating your own shortcomings is heavy. Starting over quiets that inner commentary for a moment, that voice that keeps replaying what you didn't do, finally just shuts the fuck up. You're no longer the person who didn't follow through. You're the person who is trying again. And yeah, that identity shift feels really good. That relief is so real. It's not shallow, it's just you being human. Most people don't actually want to change their lives as much as they want the pressure to stop. They want to stop feeling like they're constantly behind. They want to stop feeling like they're disappointing themselves. They want to stop carrying the quiet fear that maybe they're just not the kind of person who follows through. Starting over offers a break from that. It gives you hope without accountability yet, because accountability requires you to look at patterns, and patterns can feel pretty uncomfortable for people. It gives you optimism without emotional exposure yet, because emotional exposure means admitting where things felt hard, not where you failed. It gives you hope without accountability yet, because accountability requires you to look at patterns, and patterns can feel uncomfortable. It gives you optimism without emotional exposure yet, because emotional exposure means you're admitting where things felt hard, not just where you failed. It gives you the feeling of progress without the discomfort of staying. without the boredom, without the frustration, without the vulnerability of being imperfect in real time. That's why it feels so good. Not because you're avoiding growth, not because you're lazy, not because you don't want it badly enough, but because you're avoiding shame. You're avoiding sitting there with the feeling of, well, I tried and it didn't go the way I wanted." You're avoiding the emotional work of making sense of why you stopped without turning it into a personal flaw. A clean slate lets you feel capable again before you've had to repair the trust with yourself. And that's the part that people don't realize. Starting over feels good because it restores your sense of possibility without requiring that self honesty yet. The problem isn't that you love a fresh start. The problem is that no one taught you how to continue without shaming yourself when things get messy. Now, sometimes starting over can just feel safer than staying, and staying is where things get uncomfortable and tricky. And I don't mean uncomfortable in an over dramatic way, I mean uncomfortable in like a quiet, everyday way that slowly wears you down if you don't know how to sit with it and you aren't even aware that you're sitting with it. Staying is where the excitement fades, where the routine you were so excited to start just starts to feel repetitive, where the novelty wears off and you're left with the reality of showing up even when you don't feel inspired. Staying is where life starts interrupting your best intentions. You get tired, you get busy, something stressful happens, you miss a day, and suddenly the plan you felt so confident about just feels repetitive, boring, and fragile. And staying is where you're forced to notice how you respond when things don't go smoothly. That's the part most people are actually avoiding. For a lot of people, staying has never felt safe, not emotionally, not internally. If you grew up in an environment where mistakes were criticized, where inconsistency was punished, or where doing things wrong led to disappointment, withdrawal, or shame, your nervous system learned something very early. It learned that discomfort isn't neutral, discomfort is dangerous. So, when frustration shows up, your system doesn't register it as, oh, this is a part of me learning. It registers as something is wrong. We need to fix this. We need to get out of this. Your body reacts before your mind has time to reason with it. And that's why motivation or that's why when motivation drops or a routine breaks, it doesn't just feel inconvenient. It feels threatening. It feels like failure. It feels like exposure. And your nervous system does what it knows how to do, and that's keep you safe. It looks for an exit. Starting over becomes that exit. Starting over feels clean. It feels controlled. It feels like you're taking action. It lets you step away from the uncomfortable feeling without having to name it or sit with it. On the outside, it looks productive. It looks like ambition. It looks like responsibility, but emotionally, it's a way to escape the feeling of being bad at something that matters to you, because being bad at something you care about is vulnerable. It's scary. It brings up self doubt. It brings up old stories about not being good enough, disciplined enough, or consistent enough. Starting over lets you avoid that vulnerability because a lot of us are just so scared to be vulnerable and let our guard down. So we just think it's easier to just forget it and just start a new beginning. You don't have to sit in the frustration of learning. You don't have to tolerate the awkward middle. You don't have to be seen, even by yourself, as somebody who's trying and struggling at the same time. And here's the part that is very important to understand: avoidance doesn't always look like quitting and doing nothing. Sometimes avoidance looks like doing something new. It looks like switching routines, changing plans, starting a different program, just declaring for a fresh start. It gives your nervous system the illusion of progress without requiring that emotional endurance. But real growth doesn't happen in the reset. It happens with consistency and staying. It happens when you let discomfort exist without immediately trying to escape it. When you allow frustration to be part of the process instead of a signal that something has gone wrong. And if staying safe has never felt safe for you, of course starting over feels better. Of course it's going to feel like relief. The goal isn't to force yourself to stay through pressure. It's to teach your nervous system that discomfort does not equal danger. Once your system learns that, staying stops feeling so scary. And that's when the cycle finally begins to loosen. There's a difference between the version of you who sets goals versus the one who has to live them. And there's a mismatch happening that people don't talk about enough. And it explains so much of why we start strong and then suddenly feel like we just hit a fucking brick wall. And the version of you who sets goals is usually in a very specific state. You're calm, you're hopeful, you're thinking clearly, you're emotionally regulated enough to imagine the future without feeling super overwhelmed by it. That version of you believes in possibility. It believes in your potential. It believes that consistency is going to feel really good at the time. And that version of you is real. It's not fake, it's not delusion, it's genuinely a part of you. But the version of you who has to live those goals shows up on the real days. On days you didn't sleep well, on days you are emotionally drained, on days your schedule feels thrown off, on days you're already carrying stress before you even think about your habits. That version of you is still capable, but it's not operating from the same level of energy or regulation. And when those two versions collide, your nervous system reacts because your nervous system doesn't respond to who you want to be. It responds to what feels sustainable and safe in the moment. If the goal you set requires identity that feels unfamiliar or unstable to maintain consistently, your system will pull you back, not because you don't want it badly enough, but because it doesn't trust that version of you yet. This is where so many people get confused. They think the problem is motivation. They think they need to push harder or want it more. But what's actually happening is the habit was never integrated by who they already are. It was layered on top of them. It required you to become someone different all at once instead of growing into that identity gradually. So, when stress hits, your system defaults back to what feels familiar, not because it's better, but because it's known. And this is why people often go all in full force at the beginning because everything feels possible when you're imagining change from a regulated state. But then reality just shows up, and suddenly the routine feels heavy. The expectations feel unrealistic. The identity feels like something you have to perform instead of something that you inhabit. At that point, starting over feels easier than adjusting. And because adjusting requires self honesty, it requires you to admit that the goal was too big for your current capacity, that the identity you aimed for didn't match where you actually are right now, that you need to slow down instead of push harder. And that can feel uncomfortable. If you're used to measuring your worth by how much you can handle, starting over lets you avoid that conversation with yourself. It lets you reset without having to recalibrate. But sustainable change doesn't come from imposing an identity you're not ready to hold yet. It comes from choosing habits that your nervous system can tolerate consistently and letting your identity evolve from there. When the version of you who sets goals is the version of you who lives them starts to align, staying stops feeling like you're putting up a fight with yourself. And that's when the change actually sticks. Most people don't quit because they failed one time. They quit because the failure turned into a story. A missed day doesn't stay a missed day, it becomes evidence. A bad week doesn't stay a bad week, it becomes a pattern. One moment of resistance doesn't stay neutral, it becomes a conclusion. And the conclusion is usually something like, see, this is why I can never stick to anything. That's not discipline. That's perfectionism just wearing a little disguise, and that's fooling you. Perfectionism is sneaky because it looks responsible on the surface. It sounds like high standards. It sounds like accountability. It sounds like wanting to do things the right way. But underneath it, perfectionism isn't about excellence, it's about safety. For a lot of people, being good once meant being accepted. Being consistent once meant being praised. Being impressive once meant being safe from criticism, disappointment, or withdrawal. So your nervous system learned something pretty early on in life, and it learned that mistakes are not neutral. They're dangerous, they're scary, and that's why imperfection feels so fucking intense. When you miss a day or fall off of a routine, your body doesn't just register it as a small disruption. It registers as exposure, as proof, as confirmation of a fear that you've been carrying with yourself for a very long time. And once that fear is activated, your system looks for a way to escape it. Continuing imperfectly feels unbearable because it means staying in contact with the feeling of being bad at this. It means letting evidence exist. It means tolerating the discomfort of not meeting your own expectations. So, starting over just feels better. Starting over just wipes that slate completely. It removes the evidence. It lets you feel capable again without having to repair trust in the middle of a mess. You go from I'm failing to I'm starting fresh. That emotional shift is immediate, but it's also temporary because perfectionism doesn't teach you how to stay, it teaches you how to just keep restarting. And every restart reinforces the same loop. Try hard, then slip up. Feel shame, start over. The more you repeat that cycle, the more your brain associates consistency with pressure and collapse. That's why discipline never sticks when perfectionism is driving that bus. Real discipline is flexible, it adapts, it allows room for human error, it understands that progress is uneven. Perfectionism demands performance or nothing. At that moment, you can't perform at the level you expected. It convinces you to just quit. The truth is, continuing imperfectly is one of the most emotionally mature skills that you can possibly develop. It requires you to just let go of the idea that worth is tied to how busy you are, how well you can execute a plan. It requires you to sit with the discomfort without immediately trying to erase it. It requires self compassion paired with responsibility. When you learn how to stay after a mistake, something shifts. Mistakes stop feeling like proof of failure, they start feeling like information. And once mistakes become information instead of identity, you stop needing the clean slate. You stop needing to start over. This is when discipline actually becomes possible. Willpower gets blamed for a lot of things that it was never meant to carry. Anytime something doesn't stick, we tell ourselves, oh, we just weren't disciplined enough, that we didn't want it badly enough, that we just needed to try harder next time. But willpower was never designed to be a constant. It's something you either have or you don't have. It's a state, and like any state, it changes. Willpower fluctuates based on your stress levels, emotional load, sleep, even hormones, how supported you feel, how regulated your nervous system is. It changes day to day, sometimes hour to hour. So, when you build a plan that assumes you'll feel motivated and disciplined every single day, you're not building a plan. You're building a fantasy. That fantasy usually works for a little bit, especially at the beginning, when things are new and exciting and your nervous system hasn't just taxed it yet. But then life happens. You don't sleep well, you had a hard day, something stressful comes up, your emotional load is already heavy before you can even think about your goals. And suddenly, the same routine that felt doable last week now feels so overwhelming. And at that point, most people don't think, oh my gosh, my capacity is lower today. They think, what is wrong with me? And that's where shame starts to trickle in a little bit. You assume the problem is you, not the unrealistic expectations placed on your nervous system. Pressure based change relies on force, it relies on pushing yourself through resistance, it relies on you telling yourself to power through no matter what, no matter what's going on internally. And force works until it doesn't. Because force doesn't adapt. The moment something pushes back, Force escalates. More pressure, more self criticism, more all or nothing thinking. That creates a cycle where your goal starts to feel heavy instead of supportive. They feel like something you have to survive instead of something that fits into your life. Partnership based change works a little different. Partnership means working with your capacity instead of against it. It means building plans that can bend and change when life gets hard instead of just completely breaking them. It means showing your routines look different on different days without labeling it as failure or you're doing horrible at this. Partnership says, what's realistic for me today? Pressure says, you should be able to do this no matter what. Your nervous system will always respond better to partnership than force. When your system feels supported instead of threatened, consistency becomes more possible, not because you suddenly have more willpower, but because you're no longer demanding more than your system can give. That's the part no one teaches. Willpower isn't the foundation of lasting change. Safety is. When your goals are built in a way that respects your humanity, you stop needing willpower to carry everything. And that's when things finally just start to stick. The shift that changes everything is simple, but it's very uncomfortable. And that's usually why people just skip over it. Most people keep asking, how do I stay motivated? Or how do I make myself more disciplined? But those questions assume that motivation is the thing that creates consistency. It's not. The real question is, what am I willing to stay with? Because change doesn't happen when things feel good, it happens when you stop running the moment they don't. Staying means staying through boredom. That part is so important because boredom is one of the first things that happens after you've been consistent at something for a while. And boredom doesn't feel dangerous, but it feels pointless. It makes your brain ask, why am I even doing this? If you've always relied on excitement to carry you, boredom feels like a signal to quit. But boredom is often a signal that is something is becoming normal, that it's turning into a habit. Staying also means staying through imperfection. And this is where many people fall off. Not because they think they can't do the habit, but because they can't tolerate it doing badly. Missing a day, cutting a workout short, half following the plan, doing the bare minimum, all of that triggers old stories about failure. But imperfection is not the opposite of progress, quitting is. Staying through imperfection teaches your nervous system something new. It teaches it that mistakes don't mean danger, that nothing bad happens when you don't do things perfectly, that you don't have to reset your entire identity over and over and over. Staying also means staying through the resistance. Resistance is that internal pushback that shows up when something starts to matter. When a habit begins to ask more of you emotionally, when consistency requires you to show up even when you don't feel like it. Resistance doesn't mean something is wrong. It means you're stretching beyond what's familiar. Most people interpret resistance as a sign to stop, but resistance is often a doorway to change. Consistency isn't about streaks, it's about continuing. A streak is fragile. One break and it feels completely ruined. Continuing is flexible. It allows disruption without collapsing. Missing a day doesn't erase progress. A bad week doesn't undo the effort. Feeling unmotivated doesn't mean it's time to quit. It means you stay. And staying doesn't have to look extra and dramatic. Sometimes staying looks like doing less instead of nothing, adjusting instead of abandoning, showing up in a smaller way instead of just resetting and starting over. Every time you stay instead of restarting something new, something important happens. You build that self trust. Your nervous system starts to learn that you are someone who doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable or tough, someone who doesn't abandon yourself at the first sign of difficulty. And self trust is the foundation of lasting change. When you trust yourself, you stop needing motivation to carry you. You stop relying on pressure to push you forward. Change becomes something you participate in, not something you force. And that is what actually breaks that cycle. This season, y'all, is not about becoming someone new. It's about staying with who you are long enough to grow. No more dramatic resets, no more punishing yourself for being human, no more abandoning yourself when things get uncomfortable or tough. The version of you that stays is the version of you that changes and grows. And that is what season 3 is all about. I want to thank you so much, you guys, for tuning into today's episode of Boss Up and Glow Up. I hope this motivated you a little bit that you don't need to start completely over just because it's a new year. You just need to stay focused, stay in tune with your goals, but you don't have to do a whole new year, new me reset. If this resonated with you a little bit, share it, like it, leave a comment, let me know what part of it resonated with you the most, and of course, share it with somebody who you think needs to hear it. I love you so much. Thank you for listening. Have a great 2026.